Hello, everyone. It's great to have you here, and thank you for joining us. I am Clark Merrifield. I am the senior editor for economics and legal systems at the Journalist Resource, which is a project of the Shorenstein Center at Harvard Kennedy School. And our goal is to bridge the gap between the news media and academia. My co-host today is Michael Klein. He's the William L. Clayton Professor of International Economic Affairs at Tufts University and founder of Econofact. So speaking on tariffs today in this order, we'll have Doug Irwin, who is the John French Professor of Economics at Dartmouth College, Lydia Cox, an assistant professor of economics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and Alex Goldmark, executive producer of National Public Radio's Planet Money. So thank you all so much, truly, Doug, Lydia, and Alex, for being here today to talk about tariffs. One quick piece of housekeeping. We want to get to as many of your questions as we can. Please put your questions as they come up in the Q&A box, not the chat box, the Q&A box. And if you are comfortable doing so, please also share your name and organization. With that, I'm going to turn things over to Michael, who's going to give a brief overview of the tariff situation as it stands today and as it may stand in the coming weeks. And then we'll hear from Doug, Lydia, and Alex.
Thank you, Clark, and welcome to everybody who's participating in this webinar. A signature policy proposal, but put forward by President Trump during the campaign, was large across-the-board tariffs. President Trump claimed that the United States has been ripped off for years in its trade with other countries. His basic proposal has been for 10%, sometimes 20% tariffs on all good imports, with the exception of China, where he's talking about tariffs at 60%. He claims that this will revive manufacturing jobs. He also threatens to use tariffs for achieving foreign policy goals rather than tools like sanctions, and also imposing them on countries that, in his words, leave the dollar. What do we know from history about the effects of tariffs? What does theory and empirical analysis tell us? Well, Doug Irwin is one of the foremost scholars of international trade and the history of international trade. On Econofact, he did a podcast with us called A Brief History of International Trade and Why It Matters Today. Lydia Cox is a very influential researcher on the effects of international trade. She and her co-author, Katie Russ of UC Davis, have done a number of memos for us, one of which that got a lot of attention was the effects of steel tariffs on U.S. jobs. Lydia and Katie pointed out in original research that the ratio of jobs that use tariffs to the ratio of jobs that use steel to the number of jobs that make steel is on the order of 80 to 1. So Doug and Lydia and Alex will be able to go into much more detail about this very important issue, one that will be facing perhaps as soon as the day after President Trump's inauguration. So with that, I turn it over to Doug.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share some slides here and hope everyone can see them. I work on economic history, and I want to talk a little bit about the background to where we got today, and what sort of the historical record tells us and shows us about international trade and tariffs in particular. So the first picture I just want to show you is just the average tariff on imports from 1790, right with the founding of the country, right up to 2023. And what you can see here is that it bounces up and down. I have two series. One is the blue series, which is the average tariff. That's the average tax rate on imports, on dutiable imports. That is, imports that are subject to an import tax. The orange line is the average tariff on total imports. Now, these two are basically go in line with one another till about 1870, 1875. But then after that period, a lot of tariffs that were imposed on goods that the U.S. does not produce, such as coffee, tea, tin, bananas, those were made duty-free. And so there's a separation between the two. But the blue line is the one I tend to focus on the most, because that's the one that sort of affects domestic producers and the domestic economy in particular. So there's ups and downs here, and I'll sort of go through some of those in just a moment. But before we even get to the numbers, and you can see if you look at the y-axis, historically, those taxes have been pretty high, 20, 30, 40, 50%, sometimes even reaching 60%. But since 1950 or so, the average tariff has been very low, and that's what President Trump is trying to overturn, this sort of low period of low tariffs that we've had since World War II. Backing up for just one moment, why do we have tariffs? In fact, we have these numbers going back to 1790. The second act passed by Congress was a tariff act, and that's because tariffs raise revenue. And we didn't have the income tax back then. So if we want to start right at the beginning and continue up to the present, we have to think about, what is the purpose of the tariff that either the Congress or the administration is trying to achieve? Well, I've written a book on the history of U.S. trade policy, which came out just as President Trump was taking office. It was published then, took many years of research. But I described the purposes of the tariffs historically in the U.S. context as being one of three things. And I call them the three R's. One is revenue, one is restriction, and one is reciprocity. That is, these are what the governments are trying to strive to do when they impose tariffs. So the first one is it's a tax raised revenue. And you can think about Alexander Hamilton as the first Secretary of the Treasury, come to him in a moment. He needed to fund the federal government. It was urgently needed to fund the national defense, fund the new government, fund our national debt. And so that's why Congress passed very quickly a tariff act. We didn't have an income tax back then. You might have heard of the Whiskey Rebellion. Domestic excise taxes were not very popular. And so the tariff was the most efficient revenue-raising device at the time. But soon another objective came up, which is restricting imports to help protect domestic producers from foreign competition. Here, the goal is not to raise revenue, but to keep out imports and preserve the domestic market for domestic producers. Then the third one is reciprocity, where you're willing to change your tariffs in line with other countries. And reciprocity can take sort of a carrot or a stick approach. The carrot would be, and this is the one we've seen since World War II, is when the US says, we'll pursue a policy of reciprocity wherein we will reduce our tariffs on your goods if you reduce your tariffs on our goods. And you reach a trade agreement to reduce trade barriers, expand trade, which is presumably mutually beneficial, and make both economies better off. There's sort of a negative or a stick side to reciprocity too, which is saying, you're not treating our goods fairly in your market, and we don't like that, and so we're going to retaliate against you, and we're going to raise our trade barriers against you unless you get rid of your restrictions on us. Well, what's interesting is these three R's align almost perfectly with three different periods in U.S. economic history with respect to the tariff. So the first third of U.S. history, from the founding of the country until the Civil War, that was a period when the revenue motivation was paramount for setting import duties. You can see they go up and down there, and there's a lot of politics, of course, but this is a time when the federal government depended almost for 90% of its revenue, about 90%, almost 100%. You can see there in the first period up to the Civil War, on tariffs as a revenue-raising device. What happens with the Civil War is everything changes. There was a short-term income tax introduced, and excise taxes and other taxes were introduced. So you can see that share falls to about half of federal revenue between 1860 and the introduction of the income tax in 1913. And since then, the share of federal revenue that comes from the tariff has been very low. Corporate taxes, income taxes, Social Security, and other taxes dominate tariffs as a revenue-raising device. So revenue tends not to be very important now, but it was very important in the past. But the second period of U.S. trade history, from roughly the Civil War until the Great Depression, was one of restriction. And if you look at that blue line, it's pretty consistent with some ups and downs at about 40 to 50% or so. And that was designed to insulate the domestic market from foreign competition, to protect domestic manufacturers from foreign competition. And that was sort of the major objective of Congress in passing the tariff acts during this period at this time. But then the Great Depression changes a lot, including and especially World War II, and we enter into a new era the reciprocity era. The U.S. helped create an institution you might have heard of called the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. We now know it as the World Trade Organization, which is a body designed to coordinate countries in terms of reducing tariffs to promote trade. And that's brought those tariffs down. And that's sort of where we've been until the Trump administration took over. Lydia will talk more about the Trump administration, but let me just show you some of the highlights of the tariff in the past. It's always nice for journalists to hook a story about tariffs in the past with a different personality. So the first personality there on the left is Alexander Hamilton. I'll never forgive Lin-Manuel Miranda for not including in the Hamilton musical a song about the report on manufacturers, which Hamilton very much cared about and devoted a lot of time. He was interested in maintaining tariffs to not just raise revenue, but also to protect some domestic manufacturers for national security. The second individual there, if you can see him, is Henry Clay. The tariffs went up pretty high, but then they came down, and Henry Clay helped broker the Compromise of 1833, which was this north-south divide over whether tariffs should be high or not, and brought those tariffs down and helped save the Union. Of course, we broke apart with the Civil War. The third picture there is President Trump's favorite president, William McKinley. McKinley was not just president, but he was also chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee and helped pass the McKinley Tariff of 1890. Then the other figure up there is Smoot-Hawley. You might have heard of the Smoot-Hawley Tariff. If you're a fan of Ferris Bueller's Day Off, there's a great riff in that movie where Ben Stein plays a boring high school teacher and goes on about the Smoot-Hawley Tariff. And that's related to the Great Depression. Most economic historians don't believe that the Smoot-Hawley Tariff caused the Great Depression. And you can see that peak in the tariff there at about 60%. But it exacerbated the Great Depression and brought about this period of reciprocity. Unfortunately, what I sometimes try to involve my students with is, who are these figures like? And I was likened Smoot-Hawley to Statler and Waldorf or the Muppets, because they're both sort of cranky and older guys. And that's my very poor way of trying to motivate this for undergraduates. So bringing up to President Trump, why does he love tariffs? He says tariffs is a beautiful word, most beautiful word in the English language or in the dictionary. He likes all three R's. He's talked about the great revenue that we'll get by imposing tariffs and maybe even possibly replacing the income tax, or at least offsetting some of the revenue losses with income tax cuts. Restriction, he likes to keep out foreign goods. He wants to promote domestic industries, help create more jobs for white blue-collar workers in the Midwest, and bring manufacturing back and make America great again. And third, he wants reciprocity. He wants to bargain and cut deals with other countries. And tariffs are a great threat point to try to bring, say, Denmark to its knees, so they'll give us Greenland, or get Mexico to change its border policies. So he likes to do these deals. Now, as Lydia, I think we'll talk about in the discussion, is they're trade-offs. You can't really achieve all three objectives at the same time. If you're using tariffs to raise revenue, you're not really restricting a lot of imports because you need that tax base on which to get the revenue. If you restrict imports too much, there's not going to be much revenue. You might help out some domestic producers, but hurting others. So I'll just wrap up there. And that's just in just a few minutes, a schematic view of a lot of history of U.S. trade policy that even the president, some of his advisors seem to enjoy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doug. Yeah, we love our cranky old guys. We have a question from the audience I just want to pose to you quickly. What kind of economic retaliation should the U.S. expect from the countries these tariffs will target? And so, like, does the history shed any light on this? For example, after Smoot-Hawley, I believe that this is what happened. Can you talk about that a bit?
Sure. We have used these retaliatory tariffs in the past, usually in a very specific, targeted way. So one analogy, Michael mentioned that President Trump was thinking about imposing a 10 or 20% across-the-board tariff. Actually, President Nixon did exactly that in 1971. He imposed a 10% across-the-board import tariff, but it was designed to achieve one specific objective: get other countries to change the value of their currency on the foreign exchange market. They did that within a few weeks, and the tariffs went off. One difficulty I think that economists have with what President Trump is trying to get is that we never are exactly clear what the objective is. So there's a threat of retaliation. the threat of these higher tariffs, but it's not clear exactly what he wants in exchange. And the objectives keep changing. So in his first term, he renegotiated NAFTA and made it USMCA, the US-Canada-Mexico agreement. But now he's talking about sort of ripping that up and imposing tariffs on both Canada and Mexico. So the question is, how do you satisfy this person with there's a constant laundry list of new items that might call for retaliation?
Great. Thank you, Doug. Lydia, the floor is yours.
And I'm trying to undo my slides if they're still in the way. And I'm having some issues with that.
Hey, Doug, you can just stop sharing your screen.
Yeah, I'm trying to get back to this.
Maybe I can, I think I can override you, Doug.
Please do that.
There we go. All right.
Yep, good.
Okay, so yeah, so I'm going to turn just to kind of thinking a little bit more about what the effects of tariffs are on U.S. industries and consumers. So first, I think it's important to start by just recognizing who actually pays for tariffs. You know, when a tariff is imposed by the US, it's the US importers, so US businesses, retailers, that are importing goods that are actually responsible for paying the additional tax to allow those imports to clear customs and enter the United States. So, you know, Trump has suggested that the tariffs are paid by other countries, but this really isn't, this isn't true. So what this means is that if I'm a US retailer, you know, maybe I'm selling like imported winter jackets. It's very cold here in Wisconsin. I have to pay a higher tax on those imports. I'm likely going to try to sell the winter jackets now for a higher price in the US. And this is what I think of as the direct effect of tariffs. They increase the price of imported goods that are sold in the US markets. And this is pretty straightforward, but it has a lot of complicated ripple effects, which is what I'm gonna kind of focus on here. So the first indirect effect is that by raising the price of foreign goods, tariffs allow US producers in protected industries also to raise their prices. All right, so now US producers of winter jackets can also sell their products for higher prices because they're facing less competition from you know, those cheaper foreign imports. This makes production in the US of those protected products more profitable. And at the same time, US consumers are going to face higher prices both on imported products and also on US made products. And this is, I think, the effect that policymakers typically intend when they impose tariffs. There's this idea that by insulating industries from cheaper foreign competition, it'll make US producers more profitable. I think there's an awareness that, you know, this may cause some higher prices for consumers, but it has the benefit of potentially saving or creating jobs in protected industries. So I think this is the kind of benefit that policymakers tend to see from imposing tariffs. There's a second indirect effect, however, which is that because tariffs cause the prices of protected products to rise, US manufacturers that use those products as inputs into production are going to face higher input costs. And this is going to make production in those industries less profitable and likely also raise prices for consumers of those downstream goods. So for example, if the US imposes tariffs on steel, this is going to raise prices, or it's going to raise input costs for industries that use steel as input. So think of, you know, cars or heavy machinery. And importantly, since the tariffs raise the price not just of foreign steel, but also of US produced steel, all downstream manufacturers are going to be exposed to these higher input costs, whether they're using foreign imports as inputs into their production or whether they're, you know, buying US made steel. So again, higher input costs are going to make these downstream US industries less competitive against foreign competition and make it harder for those businesses to operate. So in a way, by trying to protect certain industries, you can actually make other industries more vulnerable. And this is kind of one of the trade-offs that Doug mentioned. So that's indirect effect number 2. The third indirect effect doesn't always happen, but it did during the first round of tariffs imposed by the Trump administration, which is that foreign countries may decide to retaliate against the US for imposing tariffs by imposing their own tariffs on US products. And if this happens, it may cause, US producers to lose sales abroad, which is another factor that makes conditions worse for US businesses. So I sort of think of these last 2 effects as like the unintended consequences of tariffs. There are these spillover effects and these extra costs that happen when tariffs are imposed, and they're not necessarily what policymakers intend. But even though they're just kind of side effects, they can actually do a lot of damage. So, I want to kind of think about what we know about all these 3 channels just from recent history. And in practice, what we've seen is that, seen from the past and also just from the first round of tariffs imposed by the Trump administration, is that on net, manufacturing employment tends to suffer more from being exposed to high input costs than it benefits from tariff protection. The reason is that, in many cases, the size of these downstream industries dwarfs the size of the protected industry. So Michael already mentioned this at the beginning, but in the case of steel, we've estimated that the number of jobs in steel using industries outnumbers the number of jobs in steel producing industries by 80 to 1. And so what this means is that for any, for any single worker that imposing steel tariffs potentially protects, there are 80 workers in industries that are going to be potentially harmed by having higher steel costs. So that's kind of lesson number 1. These indirect effects of higher input costs are actually really large, and in many cases can kind of outweigh the benefits of the tariff protection in other industries. Second lesson from the recently imposed tariffs is that retaliation from other countries actually hurts US industries as well. And this was particularly pronounced in the agriculture industries in the first round of Trump tariffs. So there's some estimates from the USDA that the US lost export sales, especially on soybean exports to China, but also on things like sorghum, pork, and other specialty crops. And because of the fact that, most of these products are grown and produced in the Midwest, that's kind of where most of these costs were concentrated in terms of kind of geographic location. So I'm going to wrap up here, but I just kind of want to summarize by saying I think the best way to think about tariffs is that they're a pretty blunt instrument. So policymakers kind of use them to try to target certain industries, and there are some potential benefits for those protected industries, but they create a lot of collateral damage along the way. And this is why I think economists tend to kind of warn against their broad-based use. So I will wrap up there.
Great.
Yeah, I can stop sharing here.
Thank you, Lydia. One quick question for you. Maybe you can speak to this. What would across the board tariffs mean for trade agreements that the US has? So the US has free trade agreements in force with about 20 countries. Do you have a sense as to like how tariffs and trade agreements might interact or supersede one another?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think in a lot of ways, this is sort of, at least in recent history, pretty unprecedented what, the tariffs that are being imposed. So, for example, Doug was mentioning that, in Trump's first term, he renegotiated NAFTA as USMCA, where we have obviously a lot of, we have a huge free trade agreement with Canada and Mexico, who are, our big trading partners. I think in order to impose the kind of tariffs he's talking about on Canada and Mexico, that agreement that we're previously, working with right now is not going to be sort of in effect anymore, because we've agreed to, trade freely with those countries. And by deciding to impose 20% tariffs, that's not part of the agreement. So I think it's a little bit hard to, predict exactly how kind of operationally things will happen, but you can't have those two things at the same time. I guess that's the big thing. Maybe Doug has something to add on that, though.
No, okay. Yeah, well, something to watch for journalists covering tariffs for sure. Alex, I'm going to turn things over to you. I believe you're going to talk about sort of from the journalist's point of view, how to make sense of all this tariff stuff and present it in a way that the general public can sort of grasp.
Yeah, mostly what we do at Planet Money and The Indicator at NPR, the shows that I work on, which is audio, is talk to folks like Doug and Lydia. In fact, we have a couple episodes featuring Doug about this already in the history. And then we try to go find examples. The thing about tariffs that is especially, I don't know, convenient for journalists is that every tariff connects to specific products that you can touch, right? So you can go and find the thing that is being subject to a tariff. And so I just wanted to give an example of how we went about that to try to make it more interesting than it might have otherwise been. We picked a Santa suit as a topic. And so here's just the beginning of an episode that we did on tariff engineering. And if the audio doesn't play automatically, I will click here.
Robert Smith, what are you wearing? I am wearing red pants, a red overcoat, a black belt. I'm dressed as Santa.
What am I wearing?
You are also wearing a Santa suit. Something I never thought I'd see, Mr. Goldstein.
Me neither. But we are surrounded by, well, I don't know, 1,000 people dressed as Santa.
I'm trying to get my belt to work.
You having belt trouble?
Yes.
So the two hosts, they go to SantaCon. They talk to all the people about their Santa suits, and then it transitions into a costume shop where the importer has multiple types of Santa suits, some of which count as festive articles under the tariff code, and some of which count as clothing, and they pay different amounts. And you learn about things like if you want to not pay a tariff, you have to put Velcro on your Santa suit, and if you put a zipper on it, it might be considered clothing. And all this might seem absurd and highly specific about Santa suits, but it was a way to get into this broader practice of tariff engineering. And then we go and talk to a tariff engineer who admits they do tariff engineering, tells us stories of how they would take a product that should have paid one tariff, but they broke it into 2 boxes and shipped it differently, and then they paid lower tariffs. And the point gets made eventually that a ton of sort of economically destructive energy goes into getting around tariffs. And the culmination of the episode is asking this tariff engineer, should your job exist? And he says, no, it absolutely shouldn't. I should be doing something else with my time, like thinking up what new products could be made instead of how you can convert a product. And one of the most absurd ones was, he cites this famous example of a shoe company that puts a different kind of fabric on the bottom of the shoe to get a different tariff. And then once it gets imported, they rip the fabric off the bottom of the shoe, right? So you sort of realize these sort of absurd responses to different taxes at different levels between 2 different types of Santa suits. And the fun part about that one was the guy in the costume shop was bringing a lawsuit about festive articles, which is the category of like party favors, but also costumes. And earlier he had been an American producer, and when he was making things and not importing them, he started a different lawsuit arguing the exact opposite. And you just sort of realize businesses will contort themselves to the tariff incentives. And so you guys out there doing your stories will have lots of opportunity to go and find that in many different ways, I suspect. The next one is this bag here. You might have seen it. It's like a beach bag made out of I don't know, I forget what the material is, but it's plastic made in China. And this was about the question of who pays the tariff. Like Lydia was saying, the American firm is the one responsible. And I think there's something to be said for you can have an expert say it, and it doesn't feel as trustworthy, right? Especially if the president says the Chinese firm will pay it, and then an expert says, no, the Chinese firm will not pay it. It's sort of like, who should I listen to? Whoever I like most. Well, go and find the person that's
The way
doing.
the tariffs work in her case
Sorry,
is that
started
the
right away.
factory sends it.
Let me pause that. Go and find
The way the
the
tariff
person who is doing the importing and ask them how it works. And so we just take this case study, like you are doing this, you get the story of the business, we bond with the person, and then she tells us exactly how she pays tariffs.
The way the tariffs work in her case is that the factory sends its shipment of bags out of southern China. The ship full of bog bags makes its way to the ports in Los Angeles or Miami or Baltimore. The logistics company she's hired makes a declaration to Customs and Border Protection about the wholesale value of those bags and provides Kim's bank account details. If they're worth, say, $50, then a 40% tariff means she has to pay the government $20 per bag. Then, after about 30 days or so of the bog bags arriving into the US, Customs and Border Protection gets the money.
It comes right out of your checking account, which is super fun.
Automatically.
I paid $800,000 today.
You paid $800,000 in tariffs today.
Yes.
Wow.
I don't want to know what the overdraft fees are.
So, it's a lot of detail that can be a bit hard to follow, but you hear a person say, I paid this much for my checking account today. It's just irrefutable. It's just so much more persuasive than, sorry, Doug or Lydia or me, us saying it, right? To hear the person say it in the first person. And so that's the next point is, right? Each one of these, someone is doing the thing and they're paying it. We can go and find them. My last little example on things that we've covered on tariff that I think are maybe useful to as case studies is the oldest trick in the book, turn it into true crime. Try and find the conflict. And so this is a story about a American auto part maker. They make hoses, and they were losing out to a Chinese firm that was importing cheaper Chinese hoses. The tariffs hit. They expect to be saved. They are not. The person at this firm has to become a detective and figure out why is it that the competitor is not raising prices. And they find out that they have created a Thai firm, and they are now hoses made in Thailand. And they do a couple different steps to try to find out, are these really made in Thailand or were they actually made in China and shipped through? And they end up with a private
this is
investigative
information
situation.
that our investigators were able to obtain from a confidential informant.
So they had a guy on the inside who could like show them the paperwork. Is that what I'm to understand?
That's how I understood it.
This new port data from Thailand put a whole new company on their radar, a company called Virion.
They could see Sunsong was shipping hoses from China to Virion. And then somehow those same hoses were showing up as imports to one of Sunsong's subsidiaries in Ohio, coming from the other Thai company, Imperial Cable.
So I don't need to go into more of the details, but the point is, like, the guys are willing to talk. They're willing to say the details. They're willing to get, it's to their benefit, especially the American firm. And it appears that sort of trade fraud is kind of from that story, probably quite rampant. And the culmination of that particular investigation was they take it to the US government. They ask them to do something. It takes many, many months. Meanwhile, the company is on the brink of bankruptcy waiting for relief. And in the end, they say they're not going to take any action. And the sort of lesson is that, like, it's easy to get away with coming up with a subsidiary in a third-party country and shipping it over. And I suspect there will be a lot of people that will now, maybe a whole industry, try to figure out or uncover this or cause action around it. And every one of those would be an interesting true crime story that may connect to a company or a business in whatever region you're covering. And then my last thing is just a call to all journalists. Like, there are going to be so many exemptions to all of this. And I suspect every exemption is a story. And I don't know, if you find a good one, call me, let's collaborate, right? Of why that particular company got an exemption. And I look forward to that kind of reporting coming out of all of us here in this webinar. And those are my examples. I turn it back over to you, Clark, or Michael.
Thanks. Thanks, Alice. That's great. Michael, did you want to?
Yeah, I'd like to just make a couple of points building on what was said before. With respect to what Doug was showing us, it's also important to know that the role of government before World War II was quite different. So when you see the revenues as a proportion, tariff revenues as a proportion of overall revenues, you have to understand that was a period where the government was, a much smaller part of the overall economy. Just emphasizing something that Lydia said about revenues, Kamala Harris called tariffs a national sales tax. In fact, the revenue aspect of that, as sort of Lydia was pointing out, is not the same, because with the sales tax, everybody who sells the good, if there's a higher price, then the government collects that. As Lydia pointed out, import competing goods in the United States will raise their prices, but there's no tax revenue from that. And then just finally, sort of emphasizing a very important point that Alex was making, there's huge scope for corruption with tariffs. And so Alex was sort of alluding to this with like tariff fraud and things like that. But it's also, it can be very blatant political corruption where people in Congress or in the administration favor certain groups for certain reasons, and they're carve-outs. So it becomes a really kind of messy situation that's just rife for corruption and creating great economic inefficiencies.
Thanks, Michael. On this point, since we're on it, we have a question from the audience, which I think relates to this. So if you're looking at exemptions and maybe asking why a certain company got an exemption or something like that, but like where do you start? Like what are the sources of kind of real-time data on who's asking for exemptions, who's getting them? Does that data exist? And that's open to anyone. Yeah.
Yeah, I could go for that. So I think I don't know exactly how it will be like in the current, in the upcoming months, but at least for the last set of tariffs, there were basically the exemption requests were posted on a website. Before it was called regulations.gov. I don't know if they'll use the same infrastructure, but you could see the request for the exemption. You can see the companies that are making the requests. There's usually a period that's like open for comment where other parties can kind of, complain or support the exemption, and then you can see the result. It takes a while, I think, for all of that to go through. There's not always a good explanation for why the exemption was given or not, but you can see, whether it was given or not.
Okay, so that's a good place to start. Okay, great. Another question which Doug answered on the chat, but I think is maybe good to pose to everybody is basically I think boils down to how seriously to take President-elect Trump on these threats of broad-based tariffs. Are they in a sense, some way of or some, way to make a deal and they're not serious? Or are they very serious and they very well may happen? Alex, how do you view it from your point of view? Like, you're a journalist covering this. You maybe hear him say stuff during a rally. How seriously do we take it all?
This might be about my perch at Planet Money versus like a daily newspaper, but I would much rather try to find the system or the concept or the like economic idea or insight that is behind the news and then explain that so that the audience understands that rather than try to guess what will happen next, what is or what might happen, because I've found that I waste so much time doing that. That's an important role that many journalists have to do. Because if you don't pay attention to what will happen, then it might be worse decisions might be made, or ones that do not take into account your audience's chance to respond. Not a great easy answer, but it's sort of like wait till the thing happens, or imagine the categories of things that will happen and try to explain the permanent information that won't expire 3 weeks later. So how does the tariff system work? How are they collected? What have been the impacts the last time a similar tariff was put on it? What are actual business owners doing right now to prepare based on their expectations, right? So that I don't have to have my expectations be the guiding force, but it's if a business is already doing things now, that's a real action happening right now. So look for the people taking action.
Great, thanks, Alice. Doug, did you want to weigh in?
I guess Michael suggested I just comment on the question in the chat on what is the purpose or what does President Trump want to achieve? How serious is he about imposing tariffs and what the objective will be? And I think it is a combination of those three R's. And I do think that some are just sort of tariff threats that he throws out there to sort of put countries on their back heel and soften them up for a deal of some sort. Sometimes for issues unrelated to trade. I mean, we'll have to see what happens with the Panama Canal and things of that sort. But I also think he's very serious about imposing some tariffs. They're not just a threat to bludgeon other countries into giving into his views or his demands, but he does want tariffs ultimately, perhaps just on China, perhaps more widespread, because he does think it'll help American manufacturing. And I think, as Lydia showed, we import a lot of intermediate goods, and so a broad-based tariff on all imports doesn't help manufacturing necessarily. It'll help some segments, but hurt many others. So we'll just have to see ultimately. But I think he has a multiplicity of objectives.
Also, I would note that it might be very hard for him to backtrack after making such a big deal about tariffs and saying, you know, it's the most beautiful word in the English language and all that stuff. If it ends up that it's just a threat and he backtracks, it might be hard for him to sort of declare victory and go home. And it could hurt his credibility. So it could be that at some point he feels, even if countries accede to what he's been asking, he might feel that he has to impose tariffs. And one thing is that he can do this relatively easily. He doesn't have to go through Congress. Doug and Lydia can speak to this more, but there can be executive actions. So he's less constrained than he might be with other kinds of policies where you need congressional support.
Great, thank you. So this is a good question as well. How is the Federal Reserve going to react to any tariff policies, since inflationary concerns fall under their dual mandate? What's their reaction? What's the potential conflict, I guess, there?
I think that the Fed is very concerned about inflation, obviously. And inflation has come down, you know, in a very surprising way without a recession, but it hasn't come down to their target yet of 2%. It's important to make a distinction between higher prices and higher inflation. Inflation is the rate of change of prices, but over a short horizon, if prices go up, it shows up as inflation. So at this point where we're kind of on this knife edge of whether the Federal Reserve is going to allow the economy to try to continue to grow by not raising rates, or if they feel that they have to continue with their policy of raising rates to bring down inflation, any kind of policies that are going to feed through and raise prices and which will show up as inflationary pressures might be something that tips them more towards trying to slow the economy to keep inflation down. And of course, slowing the economy means that unemployment is going to rise. So I think the tariffs, if they are in fact put in place, is going to put the Fed into a sort of a harder position than it already has been in. And it's been very challenging over the last 3 or 4 years. The Fed's done, many people think eventually when they started raising rates, they did so very aggressively. They did, eventually a very good job. But this is like a whole new round of problems that could be raised with tariffs. And again, as Lydia pointed out in her discussion, it's not just the price of imported goods, but it's import competing goods as well. And it's also the use of imports as inputs. So it could feed through to a very wide range of prices if tariffs are put in as broadly as the president-elect is suggesting they would be.
Great, thanks. Lydia, can you go over the 80-to-1 figure again? We just had a question about what that meant.
Oh, sure. Yeah, so that figure is just about sort of the number of jobs in industries that actually produce steel versus the number of jobs in industries that use steel as inputs. So you want to think about kind of the one is just the steel producers themselves, and then the 80 are, automobiles, heavy machinery, other kind of metal tools, hardware, that type of thing. So there are just a lot more jobs in these downstream industries than there are in kind of steel production itself in the US.
I would just say that Lydia and Katie did an amazing job coming up with that figure because it involved these input-output tables. And it's not only if companies are supplying the car industry, but what companies are supplying the companies that are supplying the car industry. So it becomes a very complicated thing. And they did really innovative and important and painstaking research to come up with that. And as far as I know, that's kind of the definitive answer because of how good that research was that Lydia and Katie Russ have done.
Great, thank you. Another question. So where did it go? Okay, so if companies, have found that tariffs sometimes end up hurting them when they expect to help them, have companies changed their perspectives on whether they want tariffs or not? And do firms largely sort of feel the same way? Or I guess, are there some sectors of industry that, could be in favor of tariffs?
I think, generally, like there are industries or companies that know they're going to get hurt by the tariffs. I show this example in my undergrad class, but right when Trump first announced that he was putting tariffs on aluminum, I forget if it was Coors or Budweiser, started tweeting, about how bad the aluminum tariffs were going to be for, the beer industry, because of course aluminum is used in the cans that they use. So I think that there are companies and industries that know for sure that the tariffs are going to be bad for them. I think, on the other hand, there are companies that, lobby for that type of protection. So there are going to be firms and industries that, know for sure that the tariffs are going to help them, or they think they will. And then I imagine, that there's a lot of kind of mixed information about whether the tariffs are going to help manufacturing, whether they're going to hurt manufacturing. So I imagine there's a lot of, businesses that are kind of in the middle and may just not be sure whether this is going to be helpful or harmful. And then it comes down to kind of what Alex was saying before about, who do I listen to? Somebody's telling me this is going to be great. Somebody else is telling me this is going to be a problem. It's I guess you kind of have to wait and see what happens.
And who you listen to might be who greases your palm, frankly. So, again, the scope for corruption is just huge with this because it is something that's sort of easily imposed and easily removed, unlike a lot of other policies. And so it might be that, if Coors or Anheuser-Busch makes a bigger political contribution maybe they'll think twice about the tariffs on aluminum. And if they don't, maybe they won't. So I think, that's a real problem, that these are not decisions necessarily just made for economic efficiency arguments or economic equity arguments, but for darker reasons as well.
Alex, with the three stories that you talked about, and that trade fraud story was one of my, I mean, it was just great. Everyone should go listen to it. It was, as you said, a sort of mix of like true crime and tariffs, which I don't think is something that overlaps too much. But can you give us, if you can, like just a little behind the scenes of like maybe how one of those stories came about, how you got those people to talk to you?
The reporter on the trade fraud one is Keith Romer, and I do not remember how he first found that company. Often we find them in lawsuits or filings, right? Like you trace those back. Somebody who has found wrongdoing will often file something that becomes public in the legal system. But I don't know the original origin of finding that character. But sometimes we think of hypothetical characters and then we go look for them, right? So if we think there's a trend or a wider system, like the setting up a fake subsidiary in Thailand to sort of tariff wash your imports, we then might go, okay, well, who's going to talk to us who would give us the details on all of that? It's not going to be the company committing the crime. It's going to be the company suffering from it. Let's go try to find that. And we sort of like do hypothetical casting in our head to find the person or the place, which is why I said I think tariff lends itself to that more than other things, right? Federal Reserve policy is very hard to do anything like that for. But tariffs are on stuff you can grab. They affect companies that that want to be found, that have addresses you can walk up to. So I imagine that the way that we will end up covering this more is we will try to imagine the type of company, and you will know that because they're in a specific industry or they're either downstream or upstream, whatever point you think you want to make, and then we would go and try to find it, right? So a lot of people, there have been some good work already on like the washing machine and whatnot industries from the last time, right? Like that's a done story that you will have an ending to, so you can find out how it went, and it is likely to be predictive of the next time. So you can go and find your domestic washing machine maker and tell a full story in one sit-down interview. They would remember the whole arc, right? So that's the way it would come up, and then we just send somebody to go and try and talk to them and ask for more specifics.
I think sort of an overarching theme here. One of our early questions was, is Trump pro-business? And it's important to make a distinction between pro-business and pro-market. So pro-market means that you want the free market to operate. The government sort of gets out of the way in terms of fewer regulations, fewer taxes, and so on. Pro-business can be quite different. Pro-business can be you're favoring certain businesses in ways that advance their interests, but at the expense of consumers and the expense of other businesses as well. And so tariff can be sort of pro-business, or maybe more carefully said, pro-selective businesses, but it's anti-market. So I think it's important for people to understand that there is a distinction between pro-business and pro-market, and tariffs are a really good example of that distinction.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a great point. We have a question from a reporter at the Berkshire Eagle. Do tariffs impact international travel, outbound or inbound? Any side effects on international travel and travelers? I'm not thinking of anything, but you all are the experts. Is there any impact of tariffs on international travel?
To the extent that tariffs lead to the dollar strengthening, what it could mean would be that tourism could be one of the industries that is very indirectly hurt by tariffs, because it becomes more expensive to come to the United States. And so this again is kind of what Lydia was talking about, sort of an unintended consequence. So if tariffs lead to a stronger dollar, that's going to hurt any exporting industry. And one of those, is education, because we export effectively a lot of educational services by having foreign students come to the United States. But our tuition is priced in dollars. And if the dollar becomes stronger, that means the tuition becomes more expensive in pounds or yen or euros.
Lydia or Doug, do you want to add anything, or should we move on?
Oh, I think that's right.
Okay, great. This is a good one too. Are there ways that everyday people who obviously have very little control over tariffs or the national market at all, are there any ways that everyday people can prepare or protect themselves from any negative fallout from tariffs?
I think we've actually been seeing some of that because people anticipating this or businesses anticipating this, there's been a surge of buying from abroad in advance of the possibility that tariffs are going to be imposed. But if you can't buy anything by Tuesday, it might be too late.
Okay, great. Could
I mention, there's also a question about the fiscal impact of tariffs.
Sure.
And so, we talked about, Doug and Lydia both talked about, if you raise the price of a good, less will be purchased, so that will hurt the revenues. Another aspect is that with the, is mentioned about how the steel tariffs led to retaliation and tariffs on agricultural goods. So what the administration did, the first Trump administration, was they bailed out farmers. So that's another fiscal cost that, when there are these knock-on effects, the government might feel obliged or committed to helping those people who are hurt. And, any revenue that's raised through tariffs is going to be diminished or even erased through, efforts like helping out agriculture when there are these retaliatory tariffs.
Yeah, great. Doug, could you talk more about your answer to the P&G question? Someone who covers Procter & Gamble had asked, or I believe that's what P&G means, that they have 80 factories worldwide and they tend to manufacture goods sold in China in factories that are in China. So how could tariffs affect those firms?
Yeah, so for some of the bigger multinationals that produce in many, many different countries and have worldwide operations, they're going to be repositioning where they're producing things and shipping things as a result of the tariffs. So if the tariffs are China specific, I'd expect Procter & Gamble and others to sort of shift that to Vietnam, Mexico, other countries, possibly bring it back home, but more likely just ramp up production in other facilities they have around the world. And so they'll be nimble that way to avoid the tariff burden. Other firms that are smaller and just source from one particular country may find it more difficult to adjust where they're sourcing their inputs from, or other goods. I mean, a big company to watch is Apple. Apple was exempt, and consumer electronics were largely exempt from the first Trump administration. We imposed tariffs on about half of imports from China, but not Apple products. And if the president is serious about going after China, you sort of have to ramp it up on some of those other inputs that were exempted before. At the same time, Tim Cook has a relationship with the president, might be able to, for all the reasons Michael and Lydia were talking about, have some political influence on getting an exemption. So it's that trade-off between exempting favored industries at home versus really trying to hit a country particularly hard. We'll have to see how that plays out.
I guess I just want to remind everybody how dynamic all of this is, right? It's a tit for tat game theory type situation. And so we are already seeing a little bit of that where like Apple is trying to switch some production to India, and then China is making it harder for Foxconn to export the materials needed from the Chinese factory to the Indian factory, or the people, right, that would need to go to train them. So China's trying to make it harder to replace production in China with its own export controls. And so it's just a lot of dynamic whack-a-mole that all of which is according to economic logic, economically inefficient versus just making the thing and innovating and selling the thing. And so the actual impact is going to be really hard to say declaratively. And we as journalists are going to have to give sort of narrow answers about the macro effect, but with vivid cases that make you go, well, it's probably like this a lot. It's probably like that a lot. When we can't sort of declaratively say one thing or another will happen because it's a dynamic situation with tit for tat responses.
Yeah, great. Well, we are at 1 o'clock, and we actually have gotten to most of the questions. Someone did ask about the regulation.gov that you mentioned, Lydia. We'll be posting the video, and I'm going to write a tip sheet based on this webinar. That'll all be on journalistresource.org. The best way to keep up with what's going on is to sign up for our newsletter. We'll drop that link in the chat. So we'll figure out exactly how to track down that info in that piece. Michael, do you want to add anything? Any final thoughts?
I would also mention that you're more than welcome to sign up for a newsletter from Econofact. We cover quite a bit of topics linked to international trade and tariffs, along with a very wide range of other things. I send out a newsletter. We have a regular newsletter, but also there's one for journalists that I send out each time we post a new memo or podcast. And also, if you go on our site, which is econofact.org, you can look by topics. And so if you're interested in trade, you can look up trade. But there are probably a wide range of economic topics that you'd be interested in. And feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions or want to be put in contact with experts like Doug or Lydia, who are in our Econofact network.
Yeah, and Alex has dropped his email in there if you find a tariff story you want to work with him on and maybe get on Planet Money, shoot him a note too. But definitely reach out to any of us. I think we're safe saying that if you have any questions or need any help with anything. So I think that we'll leave it there. Thank you again so much, Doug, Lydia, Alex. This has been really great. Michael, let's do this again soon, of course. And thank you all for tuning in. I think that's it. So thank you all, and we will see you next time.